What if the loudest man in the room just handed away his leverage without even realizing it? That's the part almost nobody is saying out loud. Over the past several weeks, President Donald Trump has publicly mocked Canada's elected leader, referred to him as governor instead of prime minister, floated talk of annexation, and even shared altered maps where Canada appeared absorbed into the United States. And yet, in just a few short months, he will need that same leader sitting across the table to sign one of the most important trade decisions in modern North American history. That's not bold strategy. That's a high-stakes gamble playing out in real time. I've been watching this unfold carefully, and what's happening between the United States and Canada right now is far bigger than a social media feud. This isn't about bruised egos or viral posts. It's about power, leverage, legal deadlines, and a trade agreement that underpins nearly $2 trillion in economic activity, and the clock is ticking louder than most people in Washington seem to hear. Let's slow this down and walk through what's really happening. Earlier this month, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney traveled to Beijing. While there, he reached a targeted trade arrangement with China. Canada agreed to lower tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. In return, China removed retaliatory tariffs on Canadian canola, pork, and seafood. It wasn't a sweeping free trade pact. It was specific, surgical, designed to ease tension in a few critical sectors. President Trump's first reaction? He praised it. On January 16th, he said, "That's what he should be doing. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that." For a brief moment, it looked manageable, professional, almost routine. Then something shifted. 4 days later, Carney stood at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, in a speech that several global leaders privately described as the defining address of the conference. He spoke about economic coercion by powerful nations pressing down on smaller ones. He said, "If you're not at the table, you're on the menu." He never mentioned Donald Trump by name. He didn't need to. European leaders gave him a standing ovation. Transcripts of the speech circulated among officials. Even California's governor, viewed by many as a possible 2028 presidential contender, publicly said he had received multiple copies from American leaders, adding, "We need to stand up with clarity." That was the moment the tone changed. The next day in Davos, President Trump said Canada lives because of the United States and suggested Carney should remember that before making such statements. Soon after, Canada's invitation to join his Board of Peace initiative was revoked. A doctored map appeared online showing Canada absorbed into U.S. territory. And on January 24th, Trump posted something that fundamentally altered the dynamic. He referred to Mark Carney as Governor Carney, not Prime Minister, not elected leader of a sovereign nation, governor. At the same time, he threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian goods if Canada pursued trade arrangements with China, the same China deal he had publicly supported just days earlier. Now imagine the scene in Ottawa, reporters packed into a press room, cameras live, tension thick, everyone expecting outrage. Mark Carney stepped up to the podium, and he didn't explode. He calmly said President Trump is a strong negotiator. He framed the comments as part of broader upcoming trade discussions. He stated clearly that he would not respond to every social media post. No visible anger, no defensive posture, just measured composure. Then he delivered a line that reframed the entire moment. Governor Carney doesn't negotiate trade deals. Prime Minister Carney does. That wasn't restraint. That was strategy. Because what Carney appears to be building isn't a reaction. It's a structure. Each insult becomes evidence. Each threat becomes political capital. Each public humiliation becomes part of a case he can present to the Canadian public if negotiations collapse. And here's the irony most people miss. Mark Carney actually was a governor. Twice. He served as governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013. Then as governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. He helped guide Canada through the global financial crisis. He led the United Kingdom's central bank through the turbulence of Brexit. So when President Trump uses governor as an insult, he is unintentionally invoking two of the most powerful financial stewardship roles in modern economic history. Carney has spent much of his professional life being called governor by people who deeply respected his authority. The word simply doesn't land the way Trump intends. But here's where the story gets more consequential. Buried inside the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA, is something called Article 34.7. It's known as a sunset clause, and it changes everything. On July 1st, 2026, the three countries must formally decide whether to extend the agreement for another 16 years. If all agree, stability continues, trade flows, supply chains hum, investment remains predictable. But if even one country refuses to extend, the deal doesn't instantly disappear. Instead, it enters a decade of annual reviews. Every year until 2036, the three governments would have to reaffirm their commitment. 10 straight years of uncertainty. Think about what that means. Every year, manufacturers in Michigan, Ontario, and Nuevo Leon would wait to see if the framework survives. Billion-dollar investment decisions would freeze. Long-term supply chains would become fragile. And if no consensus is reached by 2036, the agreement terminates entirely, reverting trade to basic World Trade Organization rules. 30 years of deep economic integration would slowly unravel. Now consider what the Trump administration has already signaled publicly. The U.S. Trade Representative told Congress the agreement's shortcomings make a simple extension not in the national interest. Among the demands, dismantling Canada's supply management system that protects dairy farmers, ending support for softwood lumber, repealing Canada's online streaming and online news laws, possibly shifting from a trilateral framework to separate bilateral deals. On top of that, the administration wants permanent sector-specific tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles embedded in any new agreement. Canada exports more than $300 billion in goods to the United States each year. Energy, auto parts, steel. These aren't side industries, they're structural pillars. For decades, conventional wisdom held that Canada had no choice but to accept Washington's terms. After all, roughly 75% of Canadian exports go south. That dependency has always been America's leverage. But leverage only works if there's no alternative. And this is where Carney's moves begin to look different. The arrangement with China opens agricultural and energy routes to the world's second-largest economy. Canada's Buy Canadian policy redirects billions in federal spending toward domestic suppliers. Quebec is strengthening electricity export relationships with Europe. British Columbia is expanding LNG capacity oriented toward Asian markets. Canada has attracted major investment from the United Arab Emirates. Active trade discussions are underway with India, the Philippines, Thailand, and ASEAN nations. Each step slightly reduces exposure to U.S. market access. No single move replaces the American market, but collectively, they create something Canada hasn't possessed in decades, a credible Plan B. And that changes the negotiation dynamic entirely. Here's the part that feels almost counterintuitive. The more President Trump escalates rhetorically, the stronger Carney's domestic position becomes. When Trump calls him governor, Canadian voters see footage of their leader being diminished publicly. When annexation jokes circulate, national unity consolidates. Carney's approval rating reportedly jumped 8 points after the map post. Even political rivals rallied behind the phrase Team Canada. Humiliation becomes cohesion. Trump's 100% tariff threat over the China arrangement also collided with legal reality. USMCA restricts comprehensive free trade deals with non-market economies like China. But Canada's arrangement wasn't comprehensive. It was sector-specific. Trade officials pointed directly to the agreement's language and argued Canada was operating within its rights. In other words, the threat lacked legal foundation. Carney didn't counterattack. He calmly cited the text and moved on. This is where his background matters. Central bankers are trained not to blink under pressure. Their authority rests on credibility. Panic signals weakness. Weakness triggers markets. So they project steadiness, especially in turbulence. Carney appears to be applying that discipline to geopolitics. While Washington deploys loud rhetoric, Ottawa is building quiet insulation. And now the calendar matters. The formal USMCA review begins July 1st, but the groundwork happens now. That's in draft positions, internal red lines, quiet consultations. The next 60 to 90 days will shape the July meeting. The United States has publicly outlined its demands. Canada has not. Carney is letting Trump talk, because every public insult narrows Trump's own political maneuvering room. If Carney signs a deal perceived as capitulation after months of being called governor, it becomes politically toxic in Canada. His government would be accused of surrendering sovereignty. But if he refuses terms framed as disrespectful and triggers the annual review process, he can argue he stood firm. Trump, step by step, may have built the corner himself, and that leads us directly into what could become the most consequential phase of this entire story. Now, here's where the stakes stop being theoretical and start becoming very real. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement isn't just a document with signatures at the bottom. It's the framework holding together one of the most deeply integrated economic regions on Earth. Nearly $2 trillion in combined economic activity runs through this system. Factories, farms, pipelines, rail lines, electricity grids, they don't stop at the border. They crisscross it. During the recent consultation period, American businesses submitted more than 1,500 public comments about the future of USMCA. That number alone tells you something. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative had to extend hearings from 1 day to 3 just to accommodate the testimony. Steel companies spoke, auto manufacturers spoke, agricultural groups spoke, energy producers spoke. The message was consistent. Stability matters. Automakers in Michigan and Ohio depend on parts manufactured in Ontario that sometimes cross the border multiple times before a single vehicle is completed. Midwest refineries process Canadian crude oil. New England utilities rely on electricity generated in Quebec, especially during peak winter demand. American homebuilders purchase Canadian lumber. American beverage producers use Canadian aluminum. It's an ecosystem. And ecosystems don't handle annual uncertainty very well. If the Sunset Clause triggers a decade of yearly reviews, companies on both sides would face a rolling question mark. Will tariffs return next year? Will supply chains need restructuring? Should factories relocate? Should new facilities be built at all? Investors do not pour billions into projects that might become obsolete 12 months later. This isn't a one-sided vulnerability. Yes, Canada exports roughly 75% of its goods to the United States. That dependence has historically been Washington's leverage. But the United States imports over $300 billion in Canadian goods annually. Canada is one of America's largest trading partners. That's not trivial. Leverage flows in both directions. The more aggressive the rhetoric becomes, the more American industries quietly run cost-benefit analyses. What would happen if Canada refused to extend the deal? What if annual reviews introduced volatility into steel supply or auto manufacturing? What if energy flows became politically entangled? Those internal calculations aren't ideological, they're financial. And financial realities eventually override slogans. Here's what makes this moment so unusual. Every escalatory move from Washington has strengthened Carney's ability to justify resistance at home. The governor label didn't diminish him domestically, it solidified him. The annexation imagery didn't weaken Canada's position, it intensified unity. The tariff threat over the China arrangement reinforced the argument that Canada cannot rely solely on American goodwill. From a negotiation standpoint, that's almost textbook inversion. In high-level financial negotiations, the kind Carney lived inside for over a decade, you never want to corner your counterpart publicly. When someone is humiliated in front of their own audience, compromise becomes politically dangerous. Pride becomes policy. Carney understands this dynamic intimately. He spent years navigating global crises where calm communication preserved credibility. During the 2008 financial crisis, central banks didn't survive by shouting. They survived by projecting steadiness when markets were volatile. During Brexit, the Bank of England didn't lurch with every headline. It maintained institutional composure. That same discipline appears to be guiding Ottawa now. Carney hasn't responded with insults. He hasn't escalated rhetoric. Instead, he keeps referring to broader context, to long-term negotiations, to sovereign equality. He rarely deviates from tone. That consistency is intentional. Meanwhile, the political calculus inside Canada has shifted. If Carney eventually agrees to a USMCA extension that dismantles supply management for dairy farmers, strips protections from softwood lumber, repeals cultural content laws, and locks in permanent tariffs, all after months of being publicly belittled, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to defend politically. The opposition would argue he folded under pressure. Public trust could erode quickly, but if he stands firm and triggers annual reviews instead, he can argue that Canada refused to negotiate under humiliation. Even if short-term economic turbulence follows, the narrative becomes one of sovereignty defended rather than sovereignty surrendered. That narrative matters in democratic politics. Now let's zoom out further. China is watching this entire situation closely. If North American trade relations destabilize, Beijing gains breathing room in global markets. Every moment the United States and Canada spend renegotiating basic frameworks is a moment competitors use to expand influence elsewhere. That geopolitical layer cannot be ignored. At the same time, domestic American industries do not want to see a decade of rolling trade uncertainty. The business community's testimony during hearings reflects concern about unpredictability. Stability is often more valuable than maximalist demands. This is where the negotiation could reach a critical inflection point. Does the Trump administration recalibrate rhetoric before July 1st? Does it shift from public pressure to quiet diplomacy, or does it continue escalating language that hardens Canadian resolve? Because if the assumption in Washington remains that Canada has no viable alternatives and must ultimately accept whatever is offered, that assumption may collide with reality. Carney's outreach to China, the United Arab Emirates, India, ASEAN nations, and expanded Asian energy markets is not symbolic. It's incremental diversification. It doesn't eliminate dependence on the United States, but it reduces the cost of resistance. And resistance becomes credible only when walking away is survivable. That's the heart of leverage. A threat only works if the other side cannot endure the consequence. If Canada demonstrates it can absorb short-term volatility through diversification, domestic spending shifts, and alternative markets, the negotiation balance tilts. At this point, the next 156 days feel less like routine diplomacy and more like a structural crossroads. On July 1st, when representatives formally gather for the joint review, two narratives will collide. One narrative says Canada must concede because of economic gravity. The other says Canada can insist on sovereign respect because it has built buffers. Which narrative prevails depends on whether rhetoric gives way to realism. If both sides arrive recognizing mutual dependence, extension becomes possible. Compromise, though imperfect, keeps the architecture intact. Supply chains remain stable. Investors breathe easier. But if miscalculation persists, if humiliation continues to substitute for strategy, annual reviews become the likely outcome. And once uncertainty enters a system that large, it rarely leaves quickly. Here's the question that keeps echoing in my mind. At what point does a negotiation tactic built on public diminishment stop extracting concessions and start generating resistance? At what point does strength of tone undermine strength of position? Mark Carney may be holding a carefully constructed hand, or he may be executing a disciplined bluff. We won't know until the review unfolds.